Okay, part 2 of Unit 1.1, the latter Middle Ages. We had finished up the Black Death or Black Plague, the first calamity of the 14th century that we're going to discuss. And now we're moving into the second, which is the 100 Years' War. But you can see very quickly from these dates here, 1337 to 1453, that it is not exactly 100 years. It is 116 years of international warfare, which will further the misery in Europe and be the longest war in European history. It is going to be England versus France, although it's an international war. We're going to see that it draws some others in there. But when we look at wars, we're not going to be so much concerned in AP Euro because it's not a military history class with the individual military strategies, but more with the causes, which we're going to start with, the turning points, which we'll get to very quickly, the people involved, as they play an important role in new war technologies and how it changes society. So those are our main concerns as we're addressing wars as they pertain to Europe. So the first thing we're going to talk about then is the immediate cause. The English crown actually lay claim to the duchy, which is this little pink area, the Duchy of Aquitaine, inside the modern French borders. Duchy is kind of like a duke, so where like a county be a count. And so the English crown lay claim to this territory that's in France. We've seen this intertwined existence between France and England since William the Conqueror in 1066, when he held both the Norman or French crown and the English crown. So we've had this intermittently going on for quite some time. And so at the beginning of this war, most of France's fleets are actually going to be destroyed from sea battles trying to go to England. And so then after this point, the portion of the war we're going to mainly talk about, the war will be fought predominantly in France and in the Low Countries. And the Low Countries mean these countries that are low in elevation, like Belgium and the Netherlands. By 1415, most of the major battles have been won by England, and we're going to see that now Paris itself is threatened because the English have been so successful in advancing. This is because of some new war technology, and so when I talk about causes, we've talked about the cause of the war, and now we need to talk about turning points. And so this turning point is at the Battle of Crécy, and this is the real beginning of the English taking over. And that's because they're able to introduce two new war technologies, which is also a key topic of this discussion. The first is the introduction of the longbow. Before, also all military had used the crossbow, which is much more clunky, heavier, can shoot less rapidly, less accurate aim, you have to be fairly close. And so the longbow being introduced by the English in this battle is going to give them long-range capabilities. It gives them ability to pierce armor, because a longbow arrow can pierce 1 inch of wood or the armor of a knight. And these knights, if you remember from world history, are usually delegated to just fighting with swords, but if you know anything about war technology, you have to be pretty close to someone to fight them with the sword. If you're being taken out from the 200 yards away that the longbow can shoot, you're not able to get close enough to fight. Not only can the longbow shoot 200 yards away, it can shoot 6 times a minute, which is much more than the crossbow. And so with a large army of crossbowmen, you're able to significantly take out a lot of military before they get to you. So in the Battle of Crécy, we have 36,000 Frenchmen versus 12,000 English. And so looking at just those numbers, you would think the French would have the upper hand. But the English are fortified on top of a hill, which is where you want to be in a military battle. And so the French are going to have to come up this hill at these English bowmen with long bows. It's an 8-hour battle, and it's the first time the French have faced a longbow. And I mean, can you imagine what that would be like when you're like, you can't even see the person who's shooting you because they're so far away? You can't even get your greatest swordsmen up to fight because they're being just assaulted with arrows. And so the French are going to lose 10,000 men in this battle, while the English will only lose about 100. This is going to drastically change warfare in Europe. Now those cumbersome, expensive knights are going to be no longer necessary because they can't get close enough to fight. Also, the English are going to introduce the cannon. The cannon had been used for other things earlier, but in this battle is the real first implementation of it. And so using the cannon is now also going to take out these expensive castles as well. So we're losing our knights and castles in the Middle Ages, if that's a period you love, I'm sorry. But now cannons can shoot through and over the fortified castles, and so this becomes the end of centuries-long types of warfare in England and France. And so now by 1415, all the major battles have been won by the English, and they are pushing on Paris. Paris is threatened. And to top things off, the French are going to be faced with a new enemy, the Burgundians from inside France. And so France now finding itself in the middle, fighting two enemies and losing. But then we're going to see that one of the individuals we have to talk about, because they're important to the war and also to society, is this young girl by the name of Joan, known as, more commonly as Joan of Arc. She's a 17-year-old peasant girl, and she is going to show up and claim she hears voices of the angels telling her to lead the fighting. Now, I don't know if it's my bias or more modern times, when someone shows up to say they're hearing voices, that's probably not a good thing. That's someone you want to be in charge of things. But the French king is desperate. I mean, they're looking at losing Paris. They haven't won any significant battles. They're outmanned now. The technology is not on their side. And he begins to think that maybe the reason that the French are losing is because the French troops are going to brothels. They are cussing. They are immoral, and they need God. And this young lady who says that she can speak to the angels might just be the answer that they need. So she convinces Charles VII to let her lead the troops. And in 1429, she is going to lead the French army to victory at the Battle of Orleans during a very crucial stage of the war. It is crucial because out of this victory, Charles VII is going to be able to solidify his hold on the throne and create a stronger government within France. But then a couple of years later, unfortunately, Joan is going to be captured in battle by the Burgundians. And them being what would best benefit us, and of course the English being much more of an ally of theirs than the French who they're fighting against, sell Joan to the English. And at this time, the church and state are very much tied together. I mean, although England and France are Catholic at this time, the English Catholic Church and the English are going to be tied together. There's no separation of church and state. And so the English now have their enemy, the one that had kind of turned the tide toward French favor and solidified the throne to the French king, and they're going to put her on trial for heresy, which can only happen if church and state are tied together. This isn't a charge you could face in a nation like the United States, where church and state are very separate. And so they charge her of being a heretic, being wrong in religion, of leading people to hell, and she is found guilty and executed by the English by burning at the stake. The actual technical reason that they were able to charge her as a heretic is that she dressed as a man during battle, and there is a verse in the Bible about women should not be dressing as men, and so they use this to charge her with heresy. So the Catholic Church and the English come together at this time, even though the French are Catholic too, and are able to charge Joan as a heretic and put her to death. But later, in 1456, so not too much longer after this, they said they made a mistake. And in 1920, so quite a bit later, she will be canonized and declared a saint. And the reason we have to speak about her, although in the greater scheme of things she might have turned the tide for a little while and her story is unique, she really is one of our first feminist leaders. She is a key person because she was a female doing a man's job. And so what's important about this, the 100 Years' War, is that the French are able to kick the English out of France by 1450. All of the English are out of France except in Calais, across from the English Channel. And so although the tide of the war was going with the English this whole time, the French are able to technically be the winners by being able to kick the English out. One of the larger results of this then is the struggles of war between the French and English during this time period are going to begin the modernization of state building in France and England. We're going to start to see very clearly that they're not intertwined anymore, that that's France and that's England, and they're sovereign. Okay, this is also going to lead to another important calamity of the 14th century, which is the peasant revolts. The causes for this are that taxation during this 100 Years' War was placed heavily on the peasants. It's usually the rich people that start the war, and it is the poor people that pay for it. They're the ones that have to do the fighting. They're the ones that end up paying for it. So this war fell very heavily on the peasant classes, and we're going to see revolts in response to this. Also, there's a demand for higher wages. At this time period, there are actually, like, we have a minimum wage law. There was actually laws put into place, like in England, where there was a maximum wage. So the peasants are going to fight for higher wages. There's going to be beginnings of hostility towards the aristocracy and higher expectations among the peasantry for their rights. These revolts are going to increase in frequency after the Black Death, as we talked about with any time that there is less supply and there's high demand, that the price goes higher. And so we'll see the peasant revolts really get out of hand after the Black Death, as we talked about in the first part of this lecture. The English peasant revolt in 1381 is the largest because as many as 100,000 were involved. The peasants in France won't be quite as successful as the English peasants in gaining some changes. But we will see the end of serfdom in England around 1550 as a result of the Black Death and of the peasants' revolts. And so very important results of all of these calamities of the 14th century. You could say definitely some negative, but some positive, and I want you to keep in that reference that out of this calamity, out of this crisis, there does breed opportunity. And to keep in mind in what ways the calamitous 14th century parallel our own time. So keep those in mind as we're moving forward. And part 3 of Unit 1.1, the latter Middle Ages, is going to be the crises in the Catholic Church. And that's going to round out our crises of the 14th century, and we'll be ready to move into Unit 1.2, the Renaissance. So we'll be picking up with the crises in the Catholic Church, the results of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, and pick up with the crises in the church on Thursday with your second part of this lecture series. And then we will be able to move in to our Renaissance unit after coming back on the 3rd, doing some review, working on DBQ and writing skills, taking our latter Middle Ages quiz on the 5th, and then we'll be into the Renaissance by the first week of September. So I look forward to getting back to you guys. If you have any questions about this lecture, please message me on Edmodo. I'd be happy to answer anything there, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.